Friday the 13th, Hell Lake, Chapter 13. The small convoy moved steadily downstairs in the morning light, comprised of military jeeps and police cars with motorcycle cops and accompaniment. Every so often a helicopter would pass over to radio details of the road ahead. For the most part, they weren't talking about highway maintenance or repairs. If, in their quasi-military methods, the authorities had made it clear that extreme measures were needed to encounter extreme developments, then it also spoke nervously of who they believed was currently winning the battle. For the federal agents and advisors who were quitting the area had insisted on the armed accompaniment to Sheriff Casey. He in turn had to call in National Guard reservists to administrate the conditions of civil emergency to be imposed on Craven County. Forest Green was the tiny nucleus of a cancer that was spreading throughout the state and beyond. The epidemic of murder, sexual violence, and gratuitous assault had spread all along the East Coast. Now it seemed the plague of murder was spreading further, with reports of sudden escalations of violence in towns near the state lines of New York, Delaware, and Maryland. The Wild West had returned again, but had made a coastal switch with the perverse, bloody vengeance. Suddenly it seemed America had more violent criminals than her borders could possibly encompass. Statistically, big cities had seen their violent crime rate rise overnight, by as much as 1/4. Smaller counties and rural towns were transformed into little hamlets of fear, paranoia, and bloodshed. A town relatively free of violent crime might find its rate rising by as much as 200% in as quick a time as it took for one random, senseless massacre to occur. The scale of the social chaos was not yet so great as to have the federal government declare a state of national emergency, but for many of the more religiously inclined in the provincial region of Craven County, it was as if the end of days had arrived. When it came to self-preservation, Paul Christos was little different from the mass of the humanity he so disdained. Riding silently, awkwardly, alongside members of the National Guard, he took advantage of the free ride Ed North had wrangled for him with Sheriff Casey. Incapable of conversing freely with those rougher types, he just huddled up to the hurriedly packed contents of his overnight bag and small suitcase. The convoy was moving in the exact opposite direction to his family home in Manhattan, but Christos had made a big decision. Only time would tell if he had the conviction to stay with it. But for now, he was taking his very first step. Equipped with a hidden handgun and more defensive chemical sprays than he could possibly use, he was hoping to break through the fear barrier somewhere along the way. As law enforcement displaced itself from the epicenter of the crime epidemic, so the priorities of protecting and serving the most vulnerable were reversed. Those without the official approval to travel with the convoy were left to either fend for themselves or quit the county. Most chose the option of flight over fight, but were impeded as soon as they hit the road. All around the edges of the different county lines, impromptu checkpoints and roadblocks were set up to check the movement of local citizens. Under the slimmest pretext, one small family or group of friends might be held up for hours, denied the right of free movement. Only the murderers and psychos who had brought chaos to their region were, it seemed, able to travel freely at will. Martial law had not been declared, but in all other senses it had arrived. As the convoy met with the first series of roadblocks at the county line, it lifted Christos's anxious heart a little to see that the authorities were doing their best to contain society's undesirable elements. Were you granted permission to travel state highways as a collective group on this scale? The officious little guardsman, eyes barely visible below his buzz-cut hair and military cap, was enjoying the power newly assigned to him. He shouted this question like a bald challenge. The bedraggled kids had been halted in their array of salvaged and damaged vehicles, formerly in pristine condition, testament to the relative wealth of many students of Forest Green. Their little convoy was already battle-weary. "Come on, man, what is all this permission shit?" Trey said with fatigue rather than aggression. Everyone felt the same way. Like, when someone sets my house on fire, I gotta get permission before I slide my ass down a rope? Do I have to pick up the correct form from the post office? Tell me, what? The weekend reservists took it as a personal affront. "The purpose of these checks is to administer security procedures relating to the movement of individuals in the center of the state." He read it like a passionate delivery of some dry-as-dust rulebook. "All civilian single-sex groups of over 2 males and other 5 females are hereby ruled potentially suspect. Civil defense law in this time of emergency decrees that all large groups, sexually mixed or otherwise, are immediately suspect except in the case that they can show official sanction for their movements." The migratory mass of kids was more than bummed out. They were weary with the terrible horrors that the world had showed them in so brief a time, yearning desperately to move on to a better place, to anywhere where they were not living in fear of annihilation, in fear of the freaks and the corpse lickers laughing in their faces as they toyed with their minds and bodies. Ah, hey! Jerry Nilsson was as exhausted as he was exasperated, like the rest of the 24+ kids that were now attached to their ramshackle convoy. He just wanted out. We were at Forest Green when the bodies started piling up around us. We're lucky to be here at all. Please! He poured every last ounce of deference into the word, believing that he and the authorities were still on the same side. Just let us get through. Nobody's ever going to be bothered by us. I mean, not ever. Forest Green? The tone of the guardsman softened a little. Like everyone in the region, he was aware of what had gone down there. The most dominant students in the group, those who orbited around Trey, all strained to hear from further down in the line. It seemed they were going to get a little official assistance at last. So when did you guys leave campus? If you've just arrived here on the county line, you presumably took off sometime early this morning? Don't we wish? Shauna's words were bitter but robbed of all passion. The events of the last 24 hours had robbed her of vigor, if not of the will to live. We've seen our friends die. We've had to fight for our lives against creatures, things, assholes. All we need is to get out of here. I mean, we're done. We're finished. We're about as messed about as a healthy body can get. If she had been able to summon up the energy, Shauna's words might have been more impassionated. As it was, she and Gretchen and mostly everybody who had got out alive that previous night had sunk into a condition of numbness that was a kind of insulting armor. All except Trey, who was still buzzing on righteous indignation. Without sleep, he was regarding the ordeal as a test he had to get through, as if it were some kind of martial arts training, much to the irritation of the others, who just felt wasted. She's right, everything she says. Jerry the jock jumped back in. We all walked out of college yesterday morning. It was the only chance any of us had. But since then, we've had to tangle with a whole shitload of creeps just to survive. We had to. The boy couldn't find the right words to express their ordeal. It was all so far outside of any of his life experience up to that point. His language was redundant. In a world where a frat party could be awesome or a close defeat on the football field was totally devastating, there were no superlative terms left to express real terror or wanton loss of life. Just wait here a moment for me, would you? It brought shouts of bad-tempered impatience from the people who waited, interminably behind them. For the ex-students of Forest Green, it was another mere inconvenience. After all, how bad could it be to get snarled up in a government line? It was irritating, sure, but at least these barriers, with their mobile offices and makeshift desk, at least there was a simulation of civil life that still went on. Trey could see the part-time soldier fussing around, grabbing the attention of superiors who didn't really want to expand any time on him. They had their own busloads of civilian irritants to deal with. But then he caught the ear of someone who wore the pale shirt and peaked cap of seniority. The guy nodded assiduously and pointed to somewhere further across the thronging enclosure. The guardsman turned straight back to them, mouthing the words, "Wait right there." See, the dude's straightening out. Jerry came alive with a little burst of optimism. Once he gives us our official ticket out of here, we'll be laughing, man. When we get home, it'll be just like Thanksgiving all over again. We'll eat turkey till we barf. The mood of his buddies and his new comrades in arms didn't lighten. Okay, he knew Shauna Black was a cranky vegetarian, but that didn't count for LeBlanc, who looked like he was seeing a tornado across the horizon. Maybe it was because he was talking about precious little home comforts that didn't seem to matter at the moment. That many of their friends would never know again. We got the Forest Green group here, right? Another of the guardman's superiors was bustling his way over, his raised arm forcing a way through lines that didn't permit space for movement. The little guardsman's cap could be seen bobbing along behind, his face invisible among a sea of shoulders that rose slightly above him. And behind him, having difficulty keeping pace, was a white sheriff's hat with the insignia of Craven County stamped upon it in silver. "Let's find ourselves a way out of here," Trey spoke aloud, but barely moving his lips. "Don't wait for them to come back. Just force a pace through the crowd and get back out to our vehicles." They all had much the same thing in mind, but each bitching, arguing mass of people was corralled into line by at least one guardsman and military police officer, All took their duties very seriously, waving an army or state issue handgun around for dramatic emphasis when they felt they had to. Yeah, that's him. They could hear a familiar voice creaking below the rumble of so many others. If we're going to make a break, we'd better do it now or just forget it, Shauna told Trey. She spoke sensibly. As Casey bustled his way over with a military accompaniment, it was turn tail now or never. Trey got the feeling that every National Guardsman or state trooper's eye were now upon them. They all had their own groups of Craven County migrants to contend with. But they could hear the disorder that was attaching itself to these kids, and they saw that they constituted a bigger, more potentially troublesome group than any other currently trying to gain authorization to pass. If they made any unauthorized moves, each of these routinely armed men would take it very personally indeed. Mr. LeBlanc, Sheriff Casey addressed him directly, a little breathless. I got a report from my deputy that says you led a mass absconding from the University of Forest Green. After all, you had been placed on a round-the-clock curfew. Are you serious? Trey searched the old man's haunted eyes. We were left there to die. If the sheriff wanted to make this one personal, then Trey wished he would just bring it on. He was almost provoked into telling the old prick to lock him up now on behalf of all the kids who had quit that place of their own free will. We started coordinating evacuation from Forest Green by 4:30 of that same p.m. No one was left to die in my town, son. No one. Trey saw the bitterness in the sheriff's eyes. He knew he was the scapegoat for every failure to deal with the horror that had engulfed them, every short-sighted move and every half-hearted measure. Every student in that college was on lockdown until they could be eliminated from murder inquiries. You organized their going AWOL. That's aiding and abetting the flight of a suspect. Multiply that by a few hundred times, I reckon you've got some charges to answer. That, and the fact that you never gave me the chance to eliminate you from the Fitzgerald and Applebaum inquiries. So that was the way it was. The sheriff was never going to catch any of the vermin that were terrorizing their county. But he could make an example of someone he perceived as a rebellious college student. Sheriff, do you have any, specific charges to bring against these young people? The sergeant-at-arms who accompanied him wasn't overly concerned about the kids, just with keeping the disorganized lines moving before the whole improvised system came to a halt. Sure. The weather-beaten face had a hard time tearing itself away from Trey LeBlanc. In his cockiness, in his otherness, he personified everything about the college kids that he despised and distrusted. They're all murder suspects, every last damn one of them. They absconded from my jurisdiction when they should have remained under house arrest. None of them are exonerated from involvement in the events of the last few weeks. You didn't need to look to be told that every guardsman or lawman had just drawn a firearm or unlocked a safety guard. Trey could hear it. He could feel it. Shauna held his arm as if to stay his hand, but he had no moves, no maneuvers prepared for this. Every other student regarded their potential captors with bemusement. It was a strange and terrible thing to have to run for your life away from the forces of chaos, then to find yourself numbered among the enemy by your fellow countrymen, the ones who were entrusted to restore order. When someone finally spoke, it was no belligerent masculine voice. Let them detain us all. If that's what they want, let them lock us all up together. Gretchen's lilting, delicate tone sounded calm by the very prospect. Better prisoners under armed guard than victims in waiting. I have to say, I've heard some truly bizarre crap recently, but nothing beats this. Diane Miranda almost snarled at her colleague and newfound close confidant. These kids were under siege. Just how on earth does anyone think they can legitimately label the victims as the offenders? Her ire was fully up. The makeshift office they had been granted in the mobile trailer of the sheriff's department hardly made matters any better. Diane thought at first she had best check the place for bugs before she entered into conference with Ed. Then thought better of it. If the whole tragic mess had been handled this incompetently so far, then she was crediting them with far too much ingenuity. Potential victims? Ed stood with his back to her, clasping his fingers at the back of his skull and flexing his biceps. He gazed out the window through haphazardly hung blinds, at the gradual slew of vehicles that was released back onto the roads. None of the kids who attained victim status are actually here. We're dealing with the ones who made it. Maybe the conditions were too intense for anyone to stay reasonable, but for the first time Diane admitted to herself that she just didn't know what the score was with Edward North. Maybe his cleverness and his ability to see all the varying points of view, to gain an assessment of the overall situation had been part of what charmed the pants off her. Maybe, but right now she didn't like his detachment from the very concept of justice, and she didn't like that attained victim status. What was he thinking? That the kids who died were playing some kind of victimhood game, buying into the blame culture? I guess that's one way of looking at it. At least the real victims won't be around to sue anyone for negligence. I can't say I'd feel the same way if I was their parents, though. She was deeply and severely pissed at him, and North wasn't so insensitive that he didn't know why. You know, for all his poor man's John Wayne posturing, Casey has a point about LeBlanc and his cohorts. By their own admission, another 5 members of their party have been lost in less than 24 hours. There was no attempt to even notify law enforcement of the alleged murders. That makes for another 5 inquiries they have to be eliminated from straight off. Oh, they were running for their lives. She puffed energetically at a full-strength Marlboro. There was at least one freedom inherent in living under martial law. And I'm telling Casey, and I'm telling you, Ed, that I want to see a list of suspects and possible charges before the day is out. Otherwise, every kid that's being held in county jail can be released without charge immediately. She knew she should never have let him continue with his Machiavellian games. All that stuff about returning power to the citizenry and emergency regulations to protect individual rights had only served to endear him to Forest Green's weenie law enforcement elite. His cacophony toward power, even of the most petty kind, now seemed to her almost indecent. It shamed her to think she had believed he was on her wavelength, that he was the first guy to hit on her in years who wasn't only after one thing. But then, she was forced to admit she'd needed that one thing too, almost as much as he did. He had fucked like a man possessed, like a man just out of prison who hadn't been with a woman for many years, and never knew if he would ever have the opportunity again. I think there's a good case for releasing some of the girls. He was trying to mediate, to take the middle course. Given the nature of these crimes, the ferocity of the attack, the amount of physical strength involved, none of them can have any personal case to answer. The voice of sweet reason. She hurriedly finished her cigarette, drowning the butt in a paper coffee cup and putting a cloud of smoke toward him. He grimaced and waved it away. And what is this, some of the girls? Is it like some of the young chicks are more menacing than others? What? She really wasn't going to let him off the hook, and he knew it. I'm thinking specifically of Shauna Brown, or Black, or whatever she calls herself. She just seems so close to LeBlanc in everything he does that she's almost implicated by default. It's unfortunate, I know, but then... He shot a smile full of bared teeth, daring her to take offense. You have to admit she is a ballsy young vixen. And you're a preppy ass. He loved to get her spirit up like that. It made him kind of hot, though he still hated to hear that low-class insult, preppy. Have we had any inquiries as to students' whereabouts via the sheriff's office? She'd let him consider that for one moment, no longer. He was the new face at Shemp's. And yet the way he'd ingratiated himself with Casey made him the chief point of contact. She wouldn't tolerate him holding back anything confidential. So I believe. It's difficult to know that with Casey's cell and bleepers going off 24 hours a day, but I'm pretty sure the Andrews girls people and some others have been in touch. All the better families, as far as I can ascertain. I'm sure our friend the sheriff isn't going to stop you from making bail for them. We don't want bail. She spoke in the collective sense to remind him that Shemp and Darrow still had ethical standards to maintain, and she was the guardian of those standards. We want release without charge, unconditionally. He may have found this all an amusing game, but he was getting under her skin. Where did he get off on stigmatizing Shauna Black? Was it on account of her friendship with Trey LeBlanc, the straight-A student the local authorities had decided, arbitrarily, was some kind of wild-ass? Or was it her blue-collar origins and attitude? She blanched at how he referred to the better families. This guy with his phony liberal pretensions and his deference towards wealth and power was not her kind, just not her at all. Yet still she had succumbed to his liar's kiss, his con man's touch. She knew them for what they were now, and hated herself for loving them. And Ed, behind the duplicitous exterior, desired her for what she represented, the smart career woman, still young, not yet out of her 30s, someone who had attended law school in their youth, yet could still be swayed by him, the self-taught jailhouse lawyer, the heart and soul, blood and guts liberal of conviction. who could be seduced by him, the downwardly mobile snob. When he had her under his power, that was when he knew that his life could begin again, that there was a second chance. He thought of the old judge's words, how, under different circumstances, it would have been a pleasure to have him perform in his courtroom, and of the sour grapes comment of the defense attorney he sacked. "You're a pretty smart guy, Weston Haas, just about smart enough to talk your way into the death chamber." He had always been lectured by his dear, late mother about there being no second chances in life, but now he had proved her wrong. He would prove them all wrong this time around. Staying unidentifiable, changing his voice, and making sure no one knew his true nature. Cunningham County Jail stood brown-stoned and monolithic on the outskirts of the town of Fullerton. Its multi-story corridors echoed with the clatter of iron grid doors, the gaudy paint on the walls peeling a little more with each metallic slam. It was no different from any other county jail that Diane had seen. On the many occasions she had to defend legal aid clients arrested over the county line. But its living quarters were certainly enjoying a surge of popularity. She hadn't seen a jail as full as this since, well, never. She imagined this was the kind of influx that had filled the prison system during her childhood years, when protests against the Vietnam War were at their heights, when the hippies were lined up with their muggers and their dealers. But now there was a whole panoply of American society imprisoned within its walls. The demands on its capacity were such that, for the time being, Cunningham County housed female prisoners on the same block as their male counterparts, instead of segregating them on a separate level. As the adjoining region to Craven County, its artificial border had intercepted a whole load of people migrating their short way between the two. Fugitives of both sexes on outstanding warrants. Vagrants with nowhere to go and little to do but sit on a bench and drink liquor or cough syrup from a brown paper bag. Luckless losers on a dope charge. There was a whole low-level criminal cross-section there. Everyone but the murderers and psychos that the roadblocks were supposedly set up to intercept. Diane's heels clattered down the hall as she was accompanied by the jail sergeant-at-arms. She was impervious to any lewd shouts and suggestions that came her way. They were par for the course. But down at the end of the corridor there was a whole section of the cell block occupied by the Forest Green Posse, as she'd come to think of them. They maintained a healthy respect for most of the hapless inadequates around block, mostly due to the imposing presence of Trey LeBlanc, and the more buffed-up frame of his opposite, the football player Nilsson. That and the fact that most of the suspected offenders on the block didn't know what this huge gang of mixed-race kids was supposed to have done, just like the kids themselves. Hey, Diane felt a little awkward meeting their gaze, not wanting to encourage any false hope. They didn't look like they had any left in them. The events of the past few days had seen to that. All the kids were courteous in their own way. They gave a feeble smile or a half-hearted wave. Or, if they were part of that more prominent quartet of Trey, Shauna, Gary, and that formerly reticent little mouse Gretchen, they hung on the bars and made a direct greeting. "Okay, people, I have signed instructions for the release of all female detainees." There was a mixed but vaguely muted response. Some of the more conventional sorority girls bounced on their heels and clasped each other's hands silently. They didn't dare articulate their relief aloud. "On the basis of?" Shauna took it upon herself to voice dissatisfaction. Diane already knew this was going to be a hollow victory. "On the basis that you are all too gentle and feminine to have torn someone apart with your bare hands. You guys, on the other hand," she tipped her nod to Trey and Gary, "are still considered capable of butchering your best friends, even when you were all living under the same state of siege and all you were locked down in your room with witnesses." An irksome silence came down. Nobody wanted to dispute the justice of the girls' release or to detain them further, except perhaps one of those same young women. "I'm not going." Shauna was not opening a debate. This was her statement, plain and final. If this geek is capable of mass murder, then so am I. Her derision of Trey was only partly a joke. Death and chaos had thrown them back together, but had not made them any more compatible. As the girls filed out of the cages, Gretchen threw her gaze down the corridor with shame. Some of them were quietly glad that they had a bad bitch who would make the big statements, but that didn't mean they wanted to compete with her. Freedom and the prospect of joining up with Craven County's newly itinerant travelers, of getting out of this hellhole region, was too precious to throw away on a point of principle. The sergeant-at-arms looked glaringly at the big guys who stood around the iron door of their cell. They could have rushed him if they'd had a mind to, and they all knew it. But he was just one man. There was a whole load of twitchy armed guards currently feeling under great stress, who would avenge a fallen comrade in a moment. The kids would never have gotten away from their cell block. "I'm not going either." The announcement came surprisingly from a tiny doll-faced brunette named Tina. "If he stays, I stay." The lucky man in question was a soft-spoken dude known as Marky. He was the kind of kid some might have regarded as a dork, but he carried a certain amount of respect among Gary's friends and hanger-ons on account of his dexterity with the football. He couldn't really kick, and his tackles were on the gentle side, but he could pick it up and run with it. And like Trey, he'd been practicing martial arts for long enough to tear a piece out of any bully who tried to give him trouble. At 19, he was already approaching the level of Second Dan. Tina was pleased with herself for following Shauna's moral stand. But to the adults, it was just another unnecessary problem. "Young lady, I really don't have time for any more of this." The sergeant's voice seethed. It was the first time he'd spoken since he and Diane arrived at the big cage. "Now, if I were you, I would accept the terms of your release, which state that you will face no charges and have no further questions to answer. Otherwise, any report I make will have to stress that you have voluntarily placed yourself among the suspects in this case, which may be used in a criminal case against you. Have I made myself clear, young lady?" Tina swallowed. Sometimes grand gestures are more than they first appear to be. "Yeah, come on, ladies," Diane interjected. She didn't care for the sergeant's interference, that standing by their friends was an admission of guilt. "There is a time and a place to fight. Surely you can see this may be the time, but this is definitely not the place for it." Shauna shrugged. She'd made her statement and she wasn't backing down. "I'm staying. What she does is up to her." There was less a sense of sisterly solidarity than of rivalry. Diane searched the smaller girl's face with concern. She wasn't backing down either, though she bit her lip as she squeezed her boyfriend's hand. "Just hang in there, ladies." Diane saw that any further imploring was useless. "I'm going to be back for you soon. I'm going to get you all out of here. There's not a single credible case to answer against any of you, okay?" As she accompanied the half-dozen young women who were being released, it didn't make Diane feel a whole lot better. But however stupid it seemed to the onlooker, she realized the kids had determined to make decisions for themselves. The adult world was letting them down, and they weren't going to play by its rules anymore. And so, the end cell block on the third story of Cunningham County Jail became quieter, more lonesome than before. Marky and Tina made a display of affection to show why they were sticking together, but it cut no ice. "I swear, dude, if you don't lay off the huggy-kissy stuff, I'm gonna..." The blonde kid remembered Marky's prowess in karate. "Hang myself from the fucking bars." "Or puke," Shauna railed on them. Her stand, she was letting them know, was little to do with romantic loyalty toward Mr. Trey LeBlanc. If the guys here were considered likely suspects, then so was she. The baddest of the bad hombres on this cell block was a senorita. Night falls early when you're locked down in county. The glow of artificial light outside each cell block never allows for a true period of restfulness. But all cell lights are turned out by the guards by 8:45 p.m. at the latest. And so begins the state of electric twilight that persists right the way through until morning. In the normal run of things, at the early time of the evening, shouts would still fly between cells, as would dumb jokes, abuse, and paper messages or kites. But now the inmates were bowed, if still restless. Each cell was crammed to more than twice its capacity, and petty offenders watched their more intimidating cellmates carefully. No one wanted to indulge in too much banter and bullshit, in case a throwaway remark got them killed. The few women scattered throughout the block were placed in cells together, but either they took it in unspoken turns to nod and doze or spend their time listening to the howls of the less stable prisoners. It was only at the very end of the cell block, where all the students were locked down together, that anyone could be sure they were bound in enforced camaraderie. A long diagonal shadow carved through the light of the corridor, as the squeaking locks at the far end whined and the security door creaked open. "Hey! Hey, you!" The voice called to no one in particular, but anybody who would listen. "Yeah, you! Tell me where the college kids are in this place, and we can go walk out of here together." It took a short while to realize this guy wasn't the average guard. He had long, dark hair, greased and slicked back, contrary to regulations. He wore the blue, shapeless overall shirt and work boots, but on a closer inspection, neither were county issue. "Yeah, I'm serious." He kept his voice to a low, conspiratorial level, moving down the row as if personally addressing each prisoner he saw through the metal grids, searching each half-glimpsed face with the shadow of iron thrown across it. The security door was left ajar, and, as the interloper walked soundlessly along the balls of his feet, smiling into each cell, he was joined by further visitors to the block. There were 3 in all, once their varyingly gangling and corrupulent frames passed through the portal. The cell block started to wake up. Realization struck that these weren't guards, not in any conventional or law-abiding sense. It created excitement, bringing whoops and catcalls between those simpletons who celebrated the fact that they had gun-toting intruders in their midst. Their .22 rifles seemed to have come from the county armory, and those who told them to shut their mouths, not to alert the jail authorities, to stay quiet and let whatever was about to happen transpire. At the far end of the cell block, where the corridor ran into a brick wall and only a scurrying rat had any chance of escape, they felt the change in the atmosphere. "Who's coming down here?" Trey hissed, aggression raising his voice above its intended whisper. "I can't see." Marky, the smallest among them apart from his loyal girlfriend, twisted himself up against the frame of the metal doors. He could hear some of the excited chatter, see the flickering of shadows moving slowly down the corridor. But otherwise, the nature of the threat, if there was one, remained unseen. Even Shauna was unnerved. "No one's going to break in to get us, are they?" Her sharp insistence cut through the layer of make-believe that Tina had tried to weave around her loyalty to Marky. The girl looked like she was going to burst into tears. Trey wasn't sure. He could only listen intently for any giveaway noises. Despite all the vicious hostility, the murderous attacks, and the sheer shit-wreaking evil they had encountered, he too couldn't imagine any intruder making an assault on a prison just to get at some of its inmates, unless he reminded himself, with unease, some of those lunatics exhibited the same gung-ho lack of regard for themselves he had seen under the leadership of that big, mangled freak, that creature he was loath to dignify with a name. It had been almost as if they were unconcerned with their own lives because they thought they might be resurrected, martyrs to the cause of mindless violence. There was a shout from the end of the corridor. "Drop your weapons and identify yourselves." It was distant, muffled by the speaker's position behind the party open door, but its intent was unmistakable. The response was instantaneous. At least 2 of the stalkers hardly waited to turn around before opening fire. The reaction was immediate. The door swung back closed, without indication that any of the armed response squad had been hit. But there were shouts and squeals from the other cells, partly in excitement and partly in apprehension, as the bullets ricocheted against the bars and grids of the cells. It was hard to tell if anyone had been hit, but Trey pushed himself as close to the cell door as he possibly could, to gauge what was happening. "Let's get these damn asshole kids!" It may have been the first intruder who spoke, or it may have been any one of them. Their regional accents blurred into one guttural growl of malice, but as 2 of them ran recklessly forward, leaving their backs unguarded, the door smashed fully open with the strength of a projectile from behind. 4 members of the response unit opened fire, 2 in crouching positions from handguns, and 2 more over their heads, firing identical rifles to those held by the intruders. From the vantage point of the prisoners, nobody could tell how the gang had implanted themselves into the jail. It was only apparent that the response team was shooting to kill, to avenge colleagues who had already died when the intruders purloined their weapons. It was the more cautious of the 2 raiders who were hit. Turning to defend their position, they placed themselves as a buffer between the armed response unit and their brethren who were running breathlessly to the end of the cages. One man yelled as a bullet smashed his collarbone, bouncing off the cells instead of entering his flesh. His compadre took one in the mouth, choking and grunting as he fell to the floor, holding his fragmented teeth and bleeding gums. The first man sank to his knees, fighting to remain conscious despite the pain. Tina let out a scream as the long-haired intruder and a fat little lowlife with the goatee on his chin backed up against the walls and rounded on them. It was in that self-same moment that the first invader recognized their quarry. They hung parallel to them, with a set of keys that would have granted them access. But first they had to try to save their lives. Squeezing the butts of their .22 rifles against their hips, firing low, they opened fire on the guards who had started to flood the corridor. One of their compadres blocked their target, trying to get back to his feet. He hit the floor as several shots passed through him, one entering the back of his shoulder, one the front of his groin, and bullets crisscrossed from either side. Two of the armed response team fell, but were passed over by their comrades' forward surge as they entered the cell block corridor, outnumbering the intruders by 4-1. "Shit, man! Those motherfuckers can't take all of us! We'll rush them if they unlock the door! We'll tear them apart if they fuck with us!" Jerry's words were as much bravado as threats. Like most of the kids, he backed away from the grid, stepping back to the very edges of their cell. They were more like rats in a trap than a pack of provoked wild beasts ready to attack. Trey didn't want to retreat, but was cautious enough to not step up and take a bullet. In just a few moments, he hoped the rest of the ragtag conglomerate of psychos would be dead. All their crazed bravado would be for nothing. He wondered at what could inspire such base, self-serving men to such an act of bravery, even one as vicious and stupid as this. Then he felt its arrival. With a tense knot in his stomach, he didn't need to look to know it was there. It just appeared out of the darkness, a malevolent force of nature. For one moment the shooting stopped. The babble of fear and excitement could be heard as the shooting party drew its breath. As the malign being appeared near the head of the corridor, before his cornered shock troops, no puff of smoke, no materializing out of nothingness, but at one moment he wasn't there, and in the next Jason was ominously present. Imposing, wrathful, hideous. His terrible features crowned by the strange majesty of a black welding mask. Even those who could not see through the tiny gaps in the cell doors felt his malignancy. In the student's cell, those who had previously come under his attack shuddered and breathed hard. Tina, who had never had to face him before, sobbed softly. Trey knew now that he was something more than just a creature of violence. Jason Voorhees had long since transcended his humanity. He was a death force, something not bound by normal human limitations. If violence was in the air, then Jason could appear out of the ether. If his filthy, murdering lackeys were present, then Jason was somewhere close at hand. And the response team fired at him, with the second line dropping to the crouching position in place of their fallen number. The first four hit him with everything they had. At least one of the shots hit home, tearing holes in his back jerkin. Jason was knocked back but unbowed, unbeaten. 10 feet behind him, his feral shock troops cursed and sputtered with pain. Those shots that had barely left their mark on the masked man were ripping into their flesh, tearing them apart against the wall. Jason held his weapon high, a symbol of his intended triumph. It was no gore-encrusted blade, but something much more deadly, conjured out of recent memory. He extended the powerful semi-automatic hunting rifle from his shoulder, lining up the sight against one eye. His obliterated vacant eye, which should have been blind. Then he fired. He opened up a rapid repeat-fire fusillade, gunning down anyone in his path, hitting the guards' response team and a couple of prisoners released at the end of the corridor by humane guards all too aware that they may be about to enter hell. Jason was no longer just a living, breathing vehicle for murder, a violence-crazed thing. He was a destructive crusader, and he was declaring war on all of America. Chapter 14. Wouldn't you like to grab some real power back from this world? I mean, real power? Ed North was talking candidly to a Hispanic businessman who had paid Shimps for a legal consultation. The Mexican, expensively dressed but slightly disheveled, in a light tan suit, gold and black patterned shirt and gold chain, didn't like it one bit. He didn't like the fact that his boy's defense lawyer was using an office in Cunningham County Jail as their temporary premises. He didn't like the candor, the indiscretion that this gringo attorney was showing. He didn't like any of it. But still, there was something familiar about this legal whore, something Santo recognized. "I'm here for my nephews, Mr. North. Edward North." It wasn't like the Mex hadn't been told, but North could overlook the discourtesy. He knew he unsettled the man, who was paying the legal fees of his two nephews, because the attorney's name was so much at odds with his personal recollection. North was claiming to be someone other than the person the client remembered. Normally, the bail for Carlos and Pablo would be a formality, but I'm afraid they were caught up in the statewide sweep of known offenders and suspicious persons. The cops are using bylaws that few have heard of, he gloated inwardly. They're taking as many people off the streets as they can until the so-called state of emergency is over. Taking on the identity of Edward North wasn't that easy for Westonhouse, and his true self was beginning to show through more and more. So how much I gotta pay to get them hitting bricks? I only got so many funds I can access at the moment. Time is tough, you know. I really have to stress again, Mr. Alicante. Normal bail conditions may no longer apply. We are not dealing with the world as you and I recognize it anymore. The thin-haired Hispanic bridled slightly, wiping a layer of moisture from his mustache on this mild early December day. I said to you my name is Romero. What's the matter with you? You don't hear right. North fixed his most authoritative stare on the client. And I said to you, my name is Edward North. Now, if I were suspicious so, I'd have to say that you seem like you don't believe me, going by the stray glances and odd looks I keep receiving. Yeah, well, you remind me of someone I met one time. It was as much of a tacit admission as North needed. In his lifetime, Santo Alicante had been the most formidable Mexican mafia boss, active on both sides of the border. When he was linked with conventional organized crime, it was cocaine and heroin trafficking on a grand scale. When they finally nailed him in Mexico City, they managed to hang political assassinations on him, seeking to move the political balance of power away from his sworn enemies by means of the bomb. It was also whispered that, in that quaint old term, he was one of the most active white slavers in the region, or sexual traffickers as they were now known. Few cheap hoods raised from a Juarez gutter were as ruthless or as powerful as Alicante. On the floors above them there was a rumble of feet, a mass shouting of voices. Santo also believed he heard gunshots. Say, what the fuck is going on in this place, man? The cacophony left him ill at ease. North remembered the story of the mass riot at Reclusorio Sur prison in Mexico City. Some of the most desperate cutthroats from the barrios had taken a whole load of guards and their fellow inmates hostage. The irony was that, in trying to negotiate their way out with other prisoners' lives, they were battling against the criminal hierarchy. The prison belonged to those inmates who had the money to pay for it. Their influence and power ran the place. It was only a final act of desperation that led them to take Santo Alicante, who was living to a standard far higher than anything his captors had known at home, with good food, booze, and pussy on order when he wanted it. When they knew they weren't getting out of that place alive, their final statements was to draw a big smile across Santo's fat neck from ear to ear. Bad memories, eh? Yeah, something like that. How about you? You still have bad memories of your mama's funeral, gringo? North winced. It was a blow below the belt, but it was confirmation that Santo Alicante recognized Charles Westonhouse, his one-time fellow inmate in hell. I have memories, but I get over them. What is life if we can't shake something positive out of it? Eh, Santo? The Mex gave a nonchalant half-smile. At least now they understood each other. This really is a different world now. Finding our way out of this place was the good part. Now we have to live in a world of chaos, with all the low-life scum and the social inadequacies running them riot. All those people who made our existence a misery in the other place. Santo nodded his head. I heard other people who made it out like it's the work of El Loco. You know, the big ugly guy in the mask. North, or Westonhouse, as Alicante had known him, winced. But there's still a whole world of opportunity now that people just don't see. The violence all along the East Coast is making everybody blind. They think it's either going to drag civilization under, or else the National Guard will bring it all under control overnight. Well, this thing's got to burn out, S.A., you know. I seen violence, lots of it. I seen civil disturbances, too. Don't matter how bad it is, everything's got to run its course. But don't you see? Things are not going to be the same once they restore some semblance of normality. Westonhouse spoke with fervor, irrespective of whether or not the drab interview room might be bugged. What would they learn from it anyway? That an attorney and his client each played a prank on law enforcement by claiming to be a dead crook? They can't push everyone back into their box. There are more criminals who escape from hell than there are currently living in the United States of America, both inside and outside of prison. There isn't going to be one big law and order clampdown and then it's over. Fear is here for good now. All the states will be run in different ways. Local and federal government will be straining to preserve order. The Constitution will be a thing of the past. Political power will belong to the most ruthless. It's a new world, my friend. The former criminal hierarchy will be expected to play their part in staving off the chaos. The most astute will work hand in hand with government, rather than fighting against it. Santo got the joke. I see what you're saying about people like that grabbing some economic and political power. Makes a kind of sense. So who's going to broker the deals between the bad guys and the real bad guys in government? Guys like you, I presume? Westinghouse smiled. Well, deals are going to have to be struck on a state-by-state, county-by-county level. Whoever puts their power at the disposal of the government will be left alone to run things in their own way. The gangsters of today will be the power brokers of tomorrow. Okay, Alicante was quietly impressed, but didn't want to show too much enthusiasm. So let's say in this instance, some well-connected guy wants to help the government. Where's he going to start? Who's he going to hit, gringo? The attorney tried to cool him off. It was great to have Santo on board, but it was still early days. That's a pretty extreme way of putting it. For the time being, I'd say that our hypothetical big guy has to watch his local turf. Discover who the people are that are terrorizing the locality. Then, once a deal is brokered... So who would our guy have to kill first? Alicante was losing patience. He had a reputation for directness in both speech and conduct that was well earned. Well, I guess, said Charles Westinghouse, becoming mildly exasperated, it would be a good start to get rid of that hulking embarrassment who left the stable door open for us, and his diabolist associate. Ah, you mean El Loco, the big crazy guy. Is it true it was him and that weird spick Sanchez who led the first people out of hell, showed them how to escape? Charles Westinghouse's mind was caught in surreal recollection, a memory of nervously following a horde of madmen from a distance, over a vast, desolate gray terrain. He had relegated those memories, told himself they belonged to another life, but he wanted to believe they were just a nightmare. Yes, I do believe there may be some truth in the story. But it was a fluke, a freak chance. We can't imagine that any of us are beholden to Voorhees or the Devil Boy. I mean, can you imagine the stigma of being associated with that freak? Jason was killing everyone in his field of vision. Strewn on the ground were the bloodied bodies of guards and prisoners alike. Some inmates remained trapped in their cells, hoping that if they cowered in the corner, they would not attract the hate machine's attention. Others had freed themselves with the single set of guards' keys passed down the block, after their owner had been blasted to death. Once an enterprising prisoner was clear of their door, those who yearned for safety in numbers turned the key on the next cell, or pushed it through the metal grids in the old cell doors. Those who never cared for anything but their own hide merely ran for it. Neither made much difference to their survival prospects. Some made it out of the corridor, running with a heart-bursting intensity that told them they would never be clear, never be safe as long as they stopped running long enough to look over their shoulder, to see if the man-thing would be on their tail forever. Others had the essence blown out of their human form by wildly flying bullets. But when the ammunition was exhausted, Jason stalked down the corridor and reverted to using his hands, to slashing and disemboweling with his long machete, to rending humans' forms apart, by pulling a disarticulated arm or leg out of its socket. It was as the Crystal Lake Killer reverted to primitive violence that the Forest Green Posse made their break. Trey and Shauna had commandeered the massacred killer's rifles, with only 1 or 2 rounds left each. Gary Nilsson had bridled at that, but they told him to shut his mouth and run, relaying as many of the other kids as he could with him. The moment they chose was one of heartless opportunism. Voorhees had grabbed a demented vagrant who dared to emerge from his cell at the wrong time. As his mighty fist crushed the poor loser's teeth and jawbone, forcing them down his gullet so that he was choking on his own bones, Jerry and the other guys ran for it. The first of them made it past the behemoth, his attention centered on his victim. But they still had to clamber over dead and dying bodies, still had to push the door back against the mortal weight of the luckless few, to put several inches of wrought iron between themselves and Jason. Once another human form was reduced to mulch, Jason began to advance. He was within several feet of tearing their youthful bodies apart. Then the pain tore into his backside. The man behind the black mask turned and roared out his wordless pain. "Gotcha, you bastard! I hope that hurts like hemorrhoids from hell!" Shauna had lined up the sights of her .22 to hit the man-monster straight in the anus. No expert marksman, the first shot hit wide beneath his crotch, while the second was directly on target. As he lunged toward Shauna, another trickle of Forest Greeners ran for their lives. His bulk moved at an alarmingly fast rate for one so ungraceful. "Step aside!" Trey fired off the only round that he knew he had left in his weapon. It hit Jason dead center in the pubic region. Jason squealed and raged, and Shauna ran. She was momentarily forgotten as the pain filled his fractured consciousness. His sexual organs were of no use to him. Long ago the sensuality had been seared from his being. What was left in place of human warmth was a hatred for humanity that burned hotter than anything imaginable, except for the agonizing sting of hot lead in his genitals. The unearthly cry rang out as Shauna sprinted for freedom. As she slipped lithely below Jason's flailing hands, his maddened senses oblivious to all but pain. Trey was now the enemy writ large, the source of all confusion and all pain, the origin, in Jason's childlike mind, of all that had tormented and defeated him from day one of his existence. Trey passed through him, sweating and hyperventilating. His natural agility was heightened to an unnatural degree by his fear. The man-monster would soon assimilate its pain, as he had when Shauna had wounded him in the asshole. As he always had throughout his corrupted existence, from the time when the innocent child sank to the bottom of the lake and his twisted flesh began to rot. But, as Trey hit Jason in the wounded balls with the butt of his now unloaded rifle, the final pangs of that pain and confusion held him from responding effectively. Held him until Trey's now myopic focus reached the end of that bloody corridor, until he had clambered over a small mound of dead bodies and started to pull the crack in the iron door shut, spitting defiance in the face of the loathsome maniac, who was no longer pursuing him. It shocked Trey to realize he was not the last forest greener on the cell block. The whimpering he heard from the end of the corridor, the sight of a maddened, kill-crazy Jason in retreat toward the noise, made his bowels feel they had turned to ice. From his partial view behind the closing door, he saw only the massive form lurching towards some new object of his hatred, some arbitrary target to sate his lust for revenge. The only crying female voice left in the whole cell block. Trey re-entered the corridor, the place where all hope was now abandoned. To his stark horror, he found that they had abandoned two of their comrades in arms. As he staggered in pain, salivating in rage, Jason's powerful hand pulled little Tina from her hiding place in the cell. She whinnied like a veal calf about to be slaughtered. As he raised her aloft by her throat, the very motion placing a grip on her windpipe that began to choke the life out of her, Marky showed himself, snapping at the heels of the monster who threatened to take his baby away from him, worrying him ineffectually like a small terrier dog. Trey stood transfixed. He wanted to intervene, but without ammo he had nothing left to attack with. He was almost as frustrated as the desperate Marky who grabbed a dead prisoner's improvised weapon from the mounds of debris on the floor. "Why don't you put her down, you big ugly bastard?" As Tina's eyes rolled back in her head, Marky jumped at Jason, slashed at his arm with a shiv, a homemade blade bound with cloth to its wooden handle. Jason snorted and sighed in irritation at the creatures that were fighting back, who were hurting him instead of accepting their own death gracefully. "Come on, fuckface, show me what you've got!" It took a lot to make Jason's moribund flesh bleed. Marky drew no blood, but he was cutting the big stiff's cloth-bound arm to ribbons. Jason was irritated enough to take the kid at his word. He let Tina drop to the ground, knocking further breath from her gasping form. Marky was still lunging at Jason, slashing and thrusting at the masked man with a fervor that had convinced him he could win. With each cut from the makeshift weapon, the man-monster seemed further in retreat, even though the shiv was quivering, ready to break from its handle at any moment. Then Jason struck back. As the knife came at him one more time, he braved a lesion by lashing out at it. The blade flew one way and the handle another. As Trey retreated further back behind the door, he saw Jason bring all his strength to bear on the boy. Marky was unable to move, squirming in the freak's grasp like a worm on a hook. With his assailant trapped in one hand, Jason reached down to the floor and found the most basic of prison weapons, a razor blade welded into the head of a toothbrush. Outside the cell block corridor, the forest green posse was heading down the stairwell after checking it for guards. The chaos and cacophony would bring reinforcements soon. Who would have to make the choice of whether to pursue the escaping prisoners or challenge the murder machine that had destroyed their colleagues? "Come on, dude, we gotta get out of here. Everyone else is hauled ass." "No, they ain't," Trey corrected Jerry sharply. In one moment the boy became aware of his friend's absence. Marky? Tina! Trey's grim silence was confirmation. Jerry shouted to his buddies, his prominence among the frat boy set making him the idea of first lieutenant. "Who got some arms? Who got some ammo?" It was a desperate melee, everyone intent on finding his way out of the jail's general population section before it was too late. "Here, man, take this!" Jerry Nilsson presumed much of Trey LeBlanc. Assumed that in that one moment he would selflessly put himself back in the jaws of death. Trey had made that same assumption for himself. He turned the key in the heavy iron door and edged it open before he had time to think about it. His only weapon was a cloth for burning and a canister of butane, intended for lighter fuel, retrieved from the prisoner's homemade armory. Jason howled in his face. Trey lurched back as he brandished the body of a boy at him like it was a weapon. It was hard to tell if Marky was alive or dead. He was a piece of meat. The deformed creep had made slashing incisions into most of the boy's veins and arteries. Across his limbs and across his chest, the fabric of his clothes cut loose in a mess of bleeding flesh. And across his face, which had dissolved the boy's features into a patchwork, mosaic of cuts. Trey fought for his breath against a wave of rising tears and vomit, as the man-monster pushed the face of the dying Marky at him. At the end of the corridor, Trey could glimpse the winded, helpless form of Tina, tearfully trying to fight her way to her feet, hoping and praying for rescue. With one last vital surge of all the strength he could muster, Trey threw himself against the door, pushed it closed before Jason could use his bulk to pry it open, turned the metal key in the grinding lock, and ran. He left Marky and Tina to their fate, threw himself down the stairwell in the same manic lunge for freedom as all his peers. Although none of them had stopped to ask themselves about the personal cost, everyone had assumed Trey LeBlanc would always behave with the utmost courage. Even Trey believed that himself until now. Paul Christos knew he had cut himself adrift. On those bright, beleaguered streets on the outskirts of Atlanta, he was truly alone. He had hitched a ride with law enforcement as far south of his home state as they could take him, then taken a Greyhound even further. When the service stalled due to the driver's reluctance to enter the erupting trouble spots, he had used local bus services, crammed full of the common humanity he detested. Now he was stranded. In the space of a few days, he had followed the route he believed would be the right one, pushed himself as far toward the end of his journey as local transport systems, with their stop-start timetables, would take him. And all for what? Anything, he told himself as he loitered on those unfamiliar city streets, was better than returning home. To the disapproval of his stern father, to the New York City townhouse that meant little to him now, to the crime and violence as endemic to his own town as to this one, that he would have had to negotiate on his own without benefit of an armed escort. But he had come so far in the last few days that all semblance of safety was behind him. Christos could have reassured himself he was in the same precarious position as every fool who walked the streets now. If only he hadn't drifted so far. If he hadn't sought to pursue his personal holy grail all the way down to Florida. To live out the fantasy of becoming something greater than himself. Part of an elite society of nihilists. Something that raised him above the petty concerns and fears of common humanity. It was hard to admit it, but he'd only succeeded in making himself feel rootless and frightened. He had enough funds to see his way through, but a belt full of credit cards and a pocket full of spare change were no guarantee. People were being murdered for their spare change now. Credit cards were only good where the most reputable stores had not sent their staff home in a state of panic, and he wasn't forced to rely on the seediest hotels and restaurants. His trusty VW had been left back in Craven County when he hitched a ride with the convoy. He had told Ed North he would go back and reclaim it soon, once he had followed his personal mission through to the end. North had stayed knowingly silent. He was the only other person who knew exactly what Christos was pursuing. He may have thought it a fool's errand, or he may have believed it suicidal, but he was too diplomatic to say so. Now Christos could only reprimand himself for following this insane, compulsive course. He had lingered a little after asking for directions at the gas station. He still intended to keep heading south. What other course could he take? But every hour that went by made it seem less like a schedule and more like an aimless descent, like a free fall. As the beat-up old Chevy skidded around the pumps, dangerously close to where he stood, Paul fought the urge to remonstrate with the driver. He felt alone now, profoundly so. Even traffic was scarce on the streets. If this one driver still had the gumption to hurtle around like he was one of those damned Hispanic lowriders, then the stranger in town felt he was best advised to keep his own counsel. "Hey, S.A." The vague greeting had to be directed at him. There was simply no one else around. "Yeah, you! Little short pockets there. You want to ride out of town?" He was in favor of anything that would get him where he was going. But he didn't want to be victimized, robbed, or beaten. Worse, that paranoia was in the air everywhere now. It was just as likely to compel him to run away as it was to urge him to accept the stranger's offer. But there was something else about this scenario, something that drew him like the proverbial moth to the flame, an insane promise that defied all reason, but was compellingly attractive to him. "Well, I could certainly do with a ride." He must have looked like a lost orphan standing there, his overnight bag crumpled over his shoulder, and his one suitcase clutched tightly in his hand. It was almost a week since he had shaved. It wasn't a regular necessity, but there must at least have been some stubble showing through. "I'm taking the main route out of the city and onto the freeway. How far are you headed, little amigo?" "As far as it goes," he heard his inner voice answer as his heart pumped excitedly. "As far as it goes." I was hoping to make it to Florida?" "FLA, huh?" The dark, tousle-headed stranger thought it over a moment. "I'm heading that way myself. Let me get some gas and some potato chips and you can hop right in." It wouldn't have been the most enticing prospect, under any other circumstances, but Christos knew now he had to go through with it, whatever the risk. He would spend a lifetime regretting his cowardice if he didn't. When the driver held one heavy, rusting door open for him, he felt that in entering that decrepit Chevrolet he might be abandoning all hope. "Hey, don't be nervous, kid. You figure you're going to be taking a ride with the devil or something?" The stranger laughed at his in-joke. Paul's heart beat faster. He could share the joke, too, though he would never have dared laugh in the stranger's face. Abandoning his better judgment, Christos placed his luggage in the back of the car and entered the front driver's side. "That's it, dude. Take the steel rod from your asshole and relax. Live a little dangerously, S.A." As they swung a U-turn across a desolate city street and headed out for the interstate, Paul Christos's heart was in his mouth. Was he volunteering himself to become just another victim? One of those faceless creatures whose sole worth, he had believed, was measured in terms of how much amusement they provided for the supermen who killed them? He thought of a quote he'd once read from a European philosopher, whose humanistic tone had repelled him. One cannot be a part-time nihilist. As he understood it, this Frenchman was saying that if you counted yourself as a nihilist, believed human life had no purpose and no value, then that belief began with your own life. You were of no more intrinsic value than anyone else. Christos hated that sentiment, wanted to protest it on behalf of the nihilist Superman whose ranks he believed himself to be a part of. But right then, in that corroded old car, he began to fear that it might be coming true. It was possible his life could be taken by someone he believed to be a superior being, and it would be of no more consequence to the killer than the life of any faceless drone. As the driver slowed at a stoplight, checking if there were enough cops around to make it worth waiting, the boy in the passenger seat started to blurt it out. "Mr. Sanchez?" Ready to hit the gas, the Hispanic stalled the car. "What did you say, amigo?" He seemed too edgy. Christos sought to diminish any offense, and hoped that he hadn't made a terrible mistake. "Wayne Sanchez? I am in the presence of Wayne Ricardo Sanchez, aren't I?" The driver sat silent. He breathed deeply. There was something in his widening eyes that almost verged on panic. No one had been astute enough to call his number. Christos realized he had struck a chord of truth. Somehow, against any rational odds, reports of the Devil Boy's demise had been much exaggerated. It was overwhelming. Christos realized his dreaming had been truer than anything else he could have imagined. His excitement was bringing him to the point of tears. "I wouldn't say this to just any killer. I really wouldn't," he whined. "But you're my hero." Okay, this has been chapters 13 and 14 of Friday the 13th, Hell Lake. I hope everybody's enjoying it so far. I gotta be honest with you. Jason Voorhees wearing a welding mask, shooting a gun, getting shot in the asshole, and then getting shot in the nuts, and then screaming about it, and then screaming in the face while killing somebody. I just can't get on board with it. I'm going to finish reading the book, but I got to be honest with you. This has been a chore to finish this book. There's 5 chapters to go. Maybe it can turn around in the final act, but we're already in the home stretch. I don't know. Can I get everybody's opinion on this book so far? Drop me some comments below. This has got to be the weirdest Jason book I've ever read in my life. And I would love to get everybody else's feedback on it as they're experiencing this book with me. This is my first time reading it as well. And I gotta say, the welding mask, the rifle, Jason screaming, the whole thing about him getting shot in the asshole and the nuts, it's just too much. I mean, I had been warned a little bit about this book going into it, but actually reading the words myself just completely threw me. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys and getting your feedback on it too. Please click that like button, even though the story might not be that great. I really appreciate you guys supporting me. Take the time, just a couple seconds, click that like button for me. Drop me a comment like I asked, please. I'd love to hear from you guys and get some feedback on this story. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe. Spread the word. Let's get these books out to as many fans as we can. Click the bell so you always know when new chapters are dropping. And until next time, this has been Storytime with your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian, saying thanks for listening and have a good night.